there's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
Come with us on a musical journey through some of the most magnificent places on earth. Great towns and cities of Europe, steeped in history and beauty, and resounding with the stories and music of the world's greatest composers. Handel, Debussy, Rossini, Chopin, Elgar, Rachmaninoff. Just some of the greats in our classical destinations.
Hello, I'm Simon Callow, and welcome to Classical Destinations. We're in Madrid. The goddess on a chariot in the fountain there, drawn by two lions, is Cybele, goddess of nature. And the stupendous palace behind her is the post office. Well, that's Madrid for you.
Just as it is with tourists from all over Europe today, Spain was a very popular place with the European composers of the Baroque and classical periods. The royal courts were generous patrons, and of course there was the sun, the food, and the wine. Yet the country still very much developed its own distinctive styles of music, influenced by its dramatic landscapes, the sheer vibrancy of the light, and the wonderful colors that infuse every aspect of Spanish culture.
Here we are in the Puerta del Sol, the geographical and in many ways the social center of Madrid. Most of the buildings here were built in the 19th and the early 20th century, and over here King Carlos III, the great Enlightenment ruler of the 18th century, gazes down benevolently on this city, a city of conversation, of wit, passionately, fiercely democratic. A city of little alleyways, of small squares, of cafes, of bars. A place where art and opinion is made.
Madrid was just a small Castilian town until King Felipe II chose it to be his capital in 1561. Over the following centuries, it grew to become the beating heart of a very powerful empire. Incidentally, geographically speaking, Madrid is absolutely in the very center of Spain. Madrid works hard and plays hard, but on the surface, it's a wonderfully relaxed city. Madrid's workers certainly don't let the 9 to 5 get in the way of their enjoyment of life and love. The time-honored siesta is still very much a part of the daily routine, and Madrid is full of beautiful parks and gardens where it's possible to get well away from the bustle of the city's busy streets. This is Madrid's biggest park, the Jardines del Buen Retiro, and it's right in the middle of the city. All 1.4 square kilometers of it. At this size, no wonder it's known locally as the lungs of Madrid. These wonderful gardens date back to the 1620s and were once the exclusive domain of royalty, but all of Madrid has been able to enjoy them since 1769. This magnificent colonnaded monument is to King Alfonso XII, the last of the great Bourbon monarchs. This is the Plata Mayor, right in the middle of Old Madrid. It's a wonderful snapshot of Castilian history. Very theatrical, very Spanish. In the 16th and 17th centuries, this was the center of Madrid's social life. Everything happened here. Festivals, bullfights, even the trials of the Spanish Inquisition and, indeed, executions. Watching over it all is King Felipe III. He created the square. This imposing statue dates back to 1616. Today, life on the square is a little less dramatic, and the Plaza Mayor is better known for its outdoor cafes. Oh, and yes, a collector's market every Sunday. This is the Plaza de Toros de las Ventas, Madrid's famous bull ring. Regardless of what might happen inside, it's a truly magnificent building, and certainly makes the modern sports stadium look very bland. These statues are of Spain's most famous matadors. The bullfighting season is from March to September. During May, there's a corrida, a bullfight, every day. And you buy tickets for them, just like any other sporting event. If it's any consolation, soccer is still a whole lot more popular in Spain. Rather less confronting, but no less dramatic, is another great Spanish tradition, Flamenco. It comes from Andalusia, in Spain's south, and it's a dance that's physical, emotional, and spiritual. It's all about rhythm, clapping, foot tapping, the guitar, and of course the wooden castanets blended with vocals. There are some basic movements, but the real art of flamenco is in the improvisation. So it's all about individual expression, and what expression it is.
The Palacio Real. The 18th century Spanish Bourbon monarch certainly did things in style. This palace took 26 years to construct. It has 2,888 rooms in it, all finished to the highest standard with the greatest materials: ivory, marble, porcelain.
And virtually right next door is the Teatro Real, the Theatre Royal. Spain's royalty only had to take a short stroll through the Plaza de Oriente to attend performances at this splendidly restored opera house. In Madrid, it's simply called the Real, but it's one of the world's great classic opera houses, built in 1850 on the instructions of Queen Isabel II. Verdi came here himself to present his opera, La Forza del Destino. In 1925, it was badly damaged from the tunneling for Madrid's metro system and didn't reopen until 1966. This is the Palacio Real de Arancois, just outside Madrid, and it was the summer palace for the Bourbon kings. So they certainly didn't slum it when they were on holiday.
The Teatro Albeniz, not perhaps the most beautiful theatre in Madrid, but one of the liveliest, home to Zarzuela, which is the great untold secret of classical music. These fabulous pieces, this uniquely Spanish genre, combining speaking, singing, and dancing. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're tragic. They're always passionate, always colorful. A remarkable art form, almost never performed outside of Spain or the Spanish-speaking world. This theatre here is named after one of the great originals of classical music, and indeed of Spanish music, Isaac Albeniz, who was born in 1860, a brilliant virtuoso pianist, and for a while he ran a zarzuela theatre for some years. He also wrote a couple of operas in English, impenetrable pieces commissioned by an English aristocrat. His great triumph, though, was his piano music. He was a virtuoso prodigy as a child. He gave his first concert when he was 4. At the age of 7, he was enrolled at the Paris Conservatory, but denied place because he threw a brick through the window. But at the age of 12, he ran away from home. He went to South America. He toured around the world as a virtuoso, and he left the world his great piano suite, Iberia, which summons up Spain in the most vivid way imaginable. He died at the age of 49, and after his death, it was orchestrated, and as such has traveled around the world.
Richard Tognetti and Benjamin Martin performed the tango from the suite España. You can't help but hear Spain in the music of Albeniz. He was a wild and undisciplined character, but his sheer musical flamboyance and exuberance beautifully encapsulates the spirit of the country. Albeniz was so thoroughly infused with what it was to be Spanish that the word Spain, or indeed the names of Spanish places, appear in a great many of the titles of his works. Iberia, of course, but also the songs of Spain, the great orchestral works Spanish Rhapsody and Catalonia, the Danse Espagnole, Spanish dance, inspired by gypsy music. The list goes on. Thank goodness for that brick through the window of the stuffy Paris Conservatoire. Taming the raw talent of the young Albeniz would have been a travesty, allowing him to roam free both musically and literally, allowing him to be totally and absolutely Spanish in everything he did, has given classical music some wonderful, unique work.
This is the great musical conservatory in Madrid. Here, Albeniz studied before going to Leipzig and Brussels and Paris to continue his studies. Here, another great virtuoso pianist-composer, Enrique Granados, studied before he, too, went to Paris. And here, De Falla, Manuel De Falla, greatest of 20th century Spanish composers, sat as an external examinee, taking 7 years exams in 2 years. That's how much of a prodigy he was. It's fascinating that all of these Spanish composers went to Paris. Fascinating and ironic, because the French composers like Chabrier and Debussy and Massenet had been writing Spanish music, so-called, inspired by Spanish rhythm, Spanish melodies, Spanish atmosphere for years. But it was these composers, Albeniz and Granados, and above all, Falla, who, given extra refinement by their studies in Paris, finally wrote the 19th century's and the early 20th century's authentic Spanish music.
Manuel De Falla was a very different person to Albeniz. He was much less extrovert. In fact, his great friend Igor Stravinsky described him as being as withdrawn as an oyster. But he was certainly no less talented and no less inspired in his composing by Spanish themes and styles. Unable to face living under a fascist regime, Manuel De Falla left Spain after the Civil War and never returned. He died in Argentina in 1947. There's no doubt that Spain's great sense of its own identity, its indomitable belief in itself, helps to inform and inspire its artists. And this remarkable ability to survive, indeed to thrive, against whatever the odds, is also very evident in the country we're about to visit now, Serbia.
Here we are in Belgrade, capital of Serbia, and it's no wonder that people wanted to settle here at the confluence of two great rivers, the Sava and the Danube, just there where that little wooden hut is. That's exactly where the two rivers meet. There was a settlement here 7,000 years ago by the Vinča tribe, Neolithic peoples, and in the 7th century AD, the Serbians finally arrived. But then there was endless fighting between the Greeks, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, until eventually there was, in the 15th century, a Serbian kingdom with Belgrade as part of it. But then the Turks arrived, and then the Austrians, and more devastation and fighting. It's small wonder that we're standing on a fortress, established here in the 3rd century by a Celtic tribe, and that the island over there is called the Island of War. Here on the top of the fortress is the park, and here all of Belgrade comes one time or another during the week. They walk around, they listen to music. This is the life of the city that Serbia's greatest composer, Stefan Mokranjac, celebrated in an extraordinary sequence of compositions that he called Rukovéti. Now, you've never heard of Stefan Mokranjac, but every single Serbian knows his work intimately, his songs on their lips from the cradle to the grave.
The Serbian capital, Beograd, Belgrade to us, is Eastern Europe's best-kept secret. It is, of course, a city that's witnessed a huge amount of conflict over its very long history, including most recently the NATO bombing of 1999. But it's emerged into the 21st century as a city with a lot to entice the visitor. The NATO airstrike still rankles Serbian sensibilities. Bombed out apartment blocks and the district of the city is preserved as a reminder. But Belgrade is a city that simply gets on with life. It has survived occupations, a remarkable 300 years under the Turks, uprisings, remodelings in various styles, numerous wars, and the breakup of the Yugoslav Empire, to be finally restored as the defiant but welcoming capital of Serbia. Perhaps the most delightful aspect of Belgrade is that it isn't trying to be anything else than Belgrade. It is distinctively and unmistakably Serbian in character, but with a touch of neoclassical European architecture thrown in for good measure. There isn't the film set sterility of some cities. Instead, this is very much a lived-in city, and the visitor is welcomed as an old family friend. And the Serbs are still making up for lost time in their reconnections with their own culture. It was certainly a lifetime's work for Stefan Mokranjac, whose dedication to rediscovering and preserving traditional Serbian music, as well as composing new works, continues to have a profound influence on the country today. The drive to Negotin, the town in Serbia's east, where Stefan Stojanovic Mokranjac was born, takes 3 hours, but it's a picturesque drive, right alongside the Danube. At times, the river is anything but wide and placid. It narrows and cuts dramatically through the landscape. Along the way, you can find nestled on the shore beautiful churches and stunning ruins made even more dramatic by the wildly varied weather. Perhaps the most stunning of all is the magnificent view on Geardap Gorge, the largest gorge in Europe, a unique geological formation, the only such in the entire Danube stream. Negotin is a small market town close to the Bulgarian border, and it's extremely proud of its most famous son. A Mokranjac festival is held every year, and the house where he was born is now an absorbing museum that really provides a sense of who he was and what he achieved. Mokranjac was born just 14 years after Serbia had finally broken free of 3 centuries of Ottoman rule. So he grew up in a country still finding its feet. More significantly, a country still trying to reconnect with the key elements of its being: religion, art, literature, and of course, music. Try to imagine a country with a 300-year gap in its recent history. It affected everything, and for Mokranjac it meant that his musical aspirations had nothing to build on. No music schools, no orchestras, no books or scores, and certainly no mentors. As a composer, he was totally and absolutely on his own. Of course, the new Serbia of the late 19th century now had to make its way in the world, so Mokranjac not only started putting in place a musical establishment to nurture those that would follow him, but he started to put his country's musical history into place too. You can start to appreciate just why he's so revered in Serbia today.
Rukovet is a Serbian word meaning wreath or garland, or more literally handful of flowers gathered up. And that's exactly what Mokranjac did in his Rukoveti. He gathered up the folk tunes, the folk traditions, the folk legends of his own country, and he wove them into these 15 handfuls or garlands of song. And these Rukoveti form the core of Serbian musical life. This extraordinary educator and trainer and composer gave his country the foundation for its own musical culture, a culture which was uniquely, indigenously Serbian.
In Serbia, Mokranjac is likened to Johann Sebastian Bach. Such was his immense contribution to both secular and sacred music.
So in the Rukoveti, Mokranjac celebrated the ordinary lives of the Serbian people, but he was equally concerned to explore their deepest religious feelings, which were profound. He himself had sung as a boy in the choirs in Negotin, and now he determined to make such music himself. We're in the tiny but perfectly formed auditorium of the National Theatre and Opera House of Serbia in Belgrade. It was created as a result of a very generous personal gift by Prince Mihailo, who had liberated the Serbs from the Turks. The theatre immediately became the center of Belgrade's artistic and cultural life. It's an extraordinarily vibrant place. There are 70 actors on the payroll, over 70 principal singers in the opera, 100 ballet dancers, and an orchestra, a permanent orchestra, of over 120. It's an absolutely remarkable place with an amazing repertory and is absolutely sold out all the time. Here he is, the sadly assassinated Prince Mihailo Obrenović, the founder, in many ways, of modern Serbian culture. It was his vision that Belgrade could be a great cosmopolitan city, and it was he who sought to introduce his subjects to the riches of European culture. 1922, the year in which the kingdoms were united to form the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, an event celebrated by the placing on the facade of the Opera House of two great flaming torches symbolizing the new kingdom.
An essential element in Serbian music are the singing societies. These are public choirs that exist in every area of Serbian society, and they bring people together of all ages and abilities simply to sing. They don't necessarily perform or even worry too much about having the right voices. It's just all about the shared experience of singing. It creates a tremendous unity through song. And of course, that vital reconnection with the musical heritage that Mokranjac has made possible.
This bust is of Mokranjac at the end of his life, when he was the doyen of Serbian music. As a young man, however, he'd studied to be a mathematician, although he'd always loved music, and joined as a student the Belgrade Choral Society, a remarkable organization, an organization which in some ways helped to transform Serbia's cultural life, both musically and in literary ways, and there were connections with painters as well, and they were always on the lookout for new musical talent, and they sponsored Mokranjac to study in Munich, in Leipzig, and later in Rome. And when he came back to Serbia after these studies, he was armed to write a kind of music that Serbia had never experienced. Providing music of much greater complexity, much greater rigor and richness in these spheres than had ever been heard before. And he brought the Belgrade Choral Society to the absolute heights of musical expression. It became a world-famous chorus. And astonishingly, he took them on tour to places as remote as Constantinople, St. Petersburg, down to Dubrovnik, and right across to Berlin, where they sang for Kaiser Wilhelm II. He founded the Serbian Music School, always continuing to train his chorus to ever greater heights. Well, not surprisingly, he exhausted himself and fell very seriously ill, and then at the age of 58, died, only 3 weeks after the declaration of the First World War in 1914.
His works are sung today in Moscow, as performed by the Anima Vocal Ensemble.
The most important thing in Mokranjac's music is that Serbian people basically have preserved their national music, their folk music, that from 14th to 19th century, that was the only way to use it and remember it and passing it from father to the son. So what he did, he preserved the folk songs of Serbian people in his pieces today, and basically that is here to stay and pass on to the future generations.
That's how things were when this hotel was built in 1936. Belgrade was part of the international glamour circuit. Then things changed. There were wars, there was communism. I came here 30 years ago, and I can tell you it was not a happy place to be. But now it is. Belgrade has become, again, a great cosmopolitan center, a place filled with delight, art, architecture, music. I recommend it.